The useless princess in the vast expanse of the galaxy, there was a kingdom unlike any other, ruled by the mighty alien king, Zorath. His empire stretched across star systems, and his warriors were feared by all who knew them. But despite his power, there was one thing King Zorath could never control: his daughter, Princess Lyra. Lyra was born into a royal family, yet she was unlike the other heirs to powerful thrones. While other royal children were trained from birth in the arts of war and leadership, Lyra was different. She could not fight like her father's warriors. She struggled with every weapon handed to her, whether it was a sword, a spear, or a blaster. Her grace and beauty were admired by many, but her father saw only weakness. To King Zorath, a ruler's strength was everything. His empire was built on power, and only the strongest could survive in the galaxy. Lyra's inability to fight was a constant source of frustration for him. He would often hold private meetings with his generals, discussing how the princess's lack of combat skills made her a liability to the throne. "She is nothing but a useless princess," Zorath would mutter, his voice laced with bitterness. "How can I trust a weakling to rule after me?" The royal court could feel the tension whenever the king spoke of his daughter. Lyra, though kind-hearted and intelligent, was often overlooked. She spent her days in the palace, studying political matters, learning languages and reading about distant worlds, but none of it mattered. It was the warriors, the fighters, the conquerors who held Zorath's favor, and Lyra, no matter how hard she tried, was not one of them. One morning, during a grand banquet, King Zorath called his court to attention. The hall was filled with dignitaries and generals, all awaiting the king's orders. Lyra, standing beside her father, felt a knot tighten in her stomach. She knew what was coming. "My loyal subjects," Zorath began, his voice booming across the hall. "I have made a decision." His eyes shifted to Lyra, and she felt a cold shiver run down her spine. "My daughter, Princess Lyra, has failed to live up to the expectations of this kingdom." Lyra's heart sank. She had tried so hard. She had trained in combat, studied strategies, and pushed herself every day. But it was never enough for her father. "As your future ruler," the king continued, "Lyra will not take part in the upcoming war councils or lead any of our armies. She will remain here at the palace where she can focus on what little she does well." The words were like daggers in Lyra's heart. She tried to hold back the tears that burned at the corners of her eyes. She had always known her father was disappointed in her, but to hear him speak those words in front of the entire court, it felt like her world had shattered. As the banquet continued, Lyra excused herself quietly, slipping away from the grand hall and into the corridors of the palace. She wandered through the halls, her thoughts swirling. She was alone, lost in the emptiness of her own mind. "I am useless," she whispered to herself. "No matter what I do, I will never be good enough." Suddenly, a soft voice broke through her thoughts. "Your Highness, are you all right?" Lyra turned to see her personal aide, Rena, standing in the doorway of a nearby room. Rena was a kind woman, loyal to Lyra and always ready to offer comfort. But today, even Rena's words seemed distant. Lyra shook her head, trying to hold back her emotions. "I don't know, Rena," she said softly. Maybe my father is right. Maybe I am useless. What can I possibly do to help this kingdom if I can't even fight like a warrior?" Rena stepped into the room and placed a hand gently on Lyra's shoulder. "You are not useless, Your Highness," she said firmly. "There is more to being a ruler than fighting. You have a gift, one that no one else can match. You have the ability to unite people, to inspire them with your words and your heart." But Lyra wasn't convinced. Her father's words echoed in her mind. Useless. Weak. Unfit. It seemed like the whole galaxy thought she would never be capable of anything beyond her royal status. Days passed, and the heaviness in Lyra's heart only grew. She began spending more and more time alone, wandering the palace grounds, staring at the stars. She wanted to prove her father wrong. She wanted to show everyone that she could be more than just a princess, more than someone who lived in the shadow of her father's greatness. But how? One evening, while exploring an ancient wing of the palace, Lyra stumbled upon a hidden library. It was filled with old texts and forgotten scrolls, many of which described the legendary warriors who had once protected the galaxy. Some of these warriors, she read, had been trained in secret, far from the eyes of the royal courts. They were the best of the best, those who had mastered combat and leadership in ways no one could understand. The more Lyra read, the more a spark of hope ignited within her. There had to be more to her story. She couldn't just accept her fate. If she was truly meant to lead this kingdom one day, she would have to find her own way. She could not be the weak, useless princess her father believed her to be. That night, Lyra made a decision. She would train in secret. She would learn to fight not to prove her father wrong, but to prove to herself that she was capable of becoming the ruler her people needed. And so, the journey of Princess Lyra began. A journey that would change the course of her life and the future of her empire. Forever. A kingdom in peril. The galaxy had always been a vast, dangerous place. But for King Zorath's empire, there had been a time of peace. His warriors were undefeated, his fleets unmatched, and his kingdom prospered in a golden age that no one dared to challenge. But that peace, that invincibility, was about to be shattered. In the heart of the royal palace, the atmosphere was tense. The war councils had been called, and every high-ranking general, ambassador, and advisor was gathered. Yet despite their usual confidence, none of them seemed prepared for the storm that was coming. Word had spread of a new, unimaginable threat from the outer reaches of the galaxy. The name of this new foe sent shivers down the spines of those who had heard it. The Zalkari. King Zorath stood at the head of the table, his eyes narrowed, his jaw clenched. For once, the great leader was not sure of his next move. The Zalkari were not just another alien species. They were a collective of ruthless, technologically advanced beings who had destroyed entire civilizations before. Their ships were unlike anything seen in the galaxy, sleek and deadly, equipped with weapons that could tear through even the strongest planetary shields. Worse yet, they were relentless, and they never left survivors. "Their fleet is approaching," one of Zorath's generals reported, his voice trembling with the gravity of the news. "We don't have enough forces to match them head-on. Our best warriors, our best ships, and they won't stand a chance." The king's face darkened. "Then what do you suggest we do, General?" We must retreat, Your Majesty. Regroup. The Zalkari are too strong for us right now." Zorath's eyes flashed with anger. Retreat? It was an unimaginable thought. His empire had never retreated from a battle, not once. But the reality of their situation set in. The Zalkari were no ordinary enemies. They were conquerors, and they would not stop until the entire kingdom was in ruins. As the council continued, Lyra, who had been quietly listening in the back, felt a growing sense of unease. Her father was a ruler of great strength, but even he seemed unsure of how to face this new enemy. The whispers of doom that filled the room filled her with dread. The empire she had known her entire life, the empire that was so proud of its warriors, its power, was now vulnerable. And she, the so-called useless princess, was stuck in the shadows, ignored and powerless. She glanced toward her father, who was deep in conversation with his advisors, his face a mask of frustration and fear. He was a king who had conquered worlds. A king who had always been in control, yet now, for the first time, Lyra saw something in him she had never witnessed before. Uncertainty. She couldn't shake the feeling that the kingdom was on the edge of a precipice. Her mind raced. She couldn't sit idly by, not this time. If her father was worried, then she had to act. She had to do something, even if no one else believed in her. Even if her father thought she was weak, she couldn't ignore the call to action. Without another thought, Lyra left the council chamber, her heart pounding in her chest. She made her way through the palace halls, not stopping to speak to anyone. Her feet carried her to the royal training grounds, where she had once spent countless hours failing at combat drills. The sounds of soldiers practicing their forms echoed through the air, and the sight of their strength only deepened her frustration. She couldn't ignore the fact that her father had forbidden her from ever joining the battle. He had labeled her useless, someone who could only look on while others fought. But this time she could not simply watch. This time, the fate of the galaxy was at stake. She would not allow her father's failure to lead them to destruction. If they were to fall, she would fall with them, but not without a fight. She found the training hall that had once been her prison of failure. It was empty now, its stone floors echoing in the silence. Lyra took a deep breath, her eyes scanning the room. There was a dusty old training sword, its blade tarnished by years of disuse. It seemed like a relic from another era, but in that moment, it was the only weapon she had. She grasped the hilt, her fingers curling around it. Her body trembled slightly, not from fear, but from anticipation. She would train, she would learn, and she would fight. For the first time, a fire ignited within her. No longer would she be the princess hidden away in the palace. She would become something more, something powerful. Days passed, and Lyra kept her training a secret. Every night after the palace had gone to sleep, she would sneak away to the hidden training hall, practicing her strikes, her movements. At first it was awkward. Her form was clumsy, and the weight of the sword seemed too much for her. But the more she practiced, the stronger she became. She had to push past the doubt, the voices in her head telling her she wasn't enough. Her father's words, though harsh, fueled her determination. Then one evening, as Lyra was preparing for another late-night training session, she overheard a conversation that would change everything. "Your Highness, we've received another message from the Zalkari," a voice said. It was one of the royal advisors. "They've sent a warning. If we do not surrender, they will destroy everything. There will be no survivors." Lyra's heart sank. The Zalkari had made their intentions clear. There would be no mercy, no negotiation. They were coming, and they were unstoppable. Her father was facing the most dangerous enemy he had ever encountered, and the Empire had no plan. The warriors, the generals, the fleets, none of them could stand against this new threat. But Lyra in that moment made a decision. She would not wait for others to decide her fate. She would not sit by and watch as her kingdom was destroyed. She had spent too long hidden in her father's shadow, too long believing she was weak. If she was going to prove her worth, it was now or never. The time for training for doubting herself was over. The Empire was in danger, and Lyra would rise to meet it. She knew that the road ahead would not be easy. She would have to fight battles, face her father's anger, and endure the ridicule of those who thought her unworthy. But none of that mattered. The kingdom was in peril, and the only way to save it was to show everyone, the Zalkari, her father, the entire galaxy, that she was no longer the useless princess. She would become the warrior the Empire needed. As she tightened her grip on the sword, a sense of purpose washed over her. For the first time in her life, she knew exactly what she had to do. The hidden warrior. The days grew darker as the threat of the Zalkari loomed closer. In the royal palace, everyone was scrambling, trying to prepare for the inevitable. News of the Zalkari's brutal efficiency in conquering planets had spread like wildfire across the galaxy. The once proud empire of King Zorath, with its unbreakable fleet and legendary warriors, was now on the brink of collapse. The kingdom's pride seemed to be fading, replaced with fear and uncertainty. The Zalkari weren't just conquerors, they were executioners, and no one had ever been able to fight them off once they set their sights on a world. Inside the palace, Lyra's world had changed too. Her father, the once indomitable king, was no longer the figure of strength and control she had always known. Instead, he was a man overwhelmed by the weight of impending doom. The court was filled with whispers of his desperation. Even the fiercest of his generals were terrified of facing the Zalkari in battle. Lyra, however, found herself alone in her determination. While everyone else waited, paralyzed by fear and indecision, she moved forward with a purpose, one she had found deep within herself. The old training hall, once a place of failure, had become her refuge. Each night she snuck away, careful to avoid the guards who would surely report her activities. It was here, in the cold, empty space, that she truly began to transform. The sword, now worn and heavy in her hands, had become an extension of herself. At first she had struggled to even hold it properly, but now she wielded it with a fluid grace that surprised even her. Her strikes, once hesitant and unsure, had grown sharp, precise, and deadly. For hours each night, Lyra practiced. Her movements became faster, stronger. She learned to harness her fear, channeling it into raw, focused energy. She learned the ancient techniques of combat that had once been reserved for the elite warriors of her father's court. But it wasn't just physical strength that she honed. Her mind, too, sharpened. She studied battle tactics, read ancient military strategies, and trained her body to endure the rigors of long, exhausting fights. It wasn't enough to simply be strong. She had to be smart, calculating, and relentless. In the dead of night, Lyra found herself pushing beyond the limits of what she thought possible. She was becoming more than a princess. She was becoming a warrior, and each day the distance between the useless princess and the leader she was destined to be grew smaller. Her transformation was no longer just physical. It was mental, emotional, and spiritual. But it wasn't just the physical training that changed her. It was the discovery of an ancient relic deep in the palace archives that would unlock her true potential. One evening, as she wandered through the quiet halls of the royal library, Lyra stumbled upon a hidden chamber. Unlike the rest of the palace, this room had been untouched for centuries. The dust that covered the old scrolls and relics was a sign that no one had ventured here in ages. But something called to her, something ancient and powerful. As she stepped inside, the chamber seemed to come alive. Her breath caught in her throat as she saw it. The relic. A set of glowing crystalline stones arranged in a perfect circle, on a stone pedestal. They pulsed with an energy unlike anything Lyra had ever felt. It was not the energy of the Zalkari, whose cold, unfeeling technology seemed to drain all life from its surroundings. This was something different. It was alive, warm, and full of potential. She reached out to touch one of the stones, and the moment her fingers made contact, a surge of power coursed through her. She gasped, almost losing her balance as the world around her seemed to warp. Images flooded her mind, visions of battles, long past, of great warriors who had wielded the power of the stones before. They were not just warriors. They were legends. They had the ability to control not just their weapons, but the battlefield itself. Their power had been harnessed by the stones, and now it was flowing into Lyra. As she stood there trembling, with the intensity of the power coursing through her, she understood something crucial. This was no ordinary power. It was a legacy, an ancient strength passed down through the royal bloodline, hidden away from the world for generations. Only those who were destined to wield it could unlock it. And now, Lyra had done just that. Her heart pounded in her chest as she pulled her hand back from the stone. The visions faded, but the power remained, thrumming inside her like a living thing. She felt stronger, faster, more aware of everything around her. She was no longer the helpless princess, waiting for a king to lead her. She was a warrior, forged in the heart of an ancient secret that no one had known about, except for the few who had hidden it from the rest of the galaxy. The next few days were a blur of training and discovery. Lyra returned to the training hall, now with a new understanding of her power. The ancient energy that had awakened inside her not only enhanced her physical abilities, but it gave her an instinct for battle that she had never possessed before. She could anticipate her enemy's moves, feel the shift in the air before a strike came. Her every action, every swing of the sword, felt like it was guided by something beyond herself, something primal, something ancient. But even with all her newfound strength, Lyra knew that she could not defeat the Zalkari alone. They were too powerful, too relentless. The power she had unlocked was significant, but it was not enough to save the Empire on its own. What she needed now was an army, a force that could fight alongside her, that could fight for the survival of their people. She sought out the most trusted and capable generals in her father's court, those who still had the courage to resist the Zalkari's invasion. She spoke to them in private, her voice low and steady but with an undeniable authority. "We can't just wait for the Zalkari to destroy everything we've built," she told them. "We have the power to fight back. I have the strength to lead. Together, we can save this kingdom." At first, the generals were skeptical. They had seen the princess fail time and time again. They had been trained to believe that leadership was for warriors, not for those who could not fight. But as Lyra spoke, as she shared her vision of the kingdom's future, they began to see something different in her. A fire, a resolve that they had never expected. And in that moment, they knew she was not the useless princess she had once been. One by one, the generals pledged their support to her cause. Lyra's army was beginning to take shape, and though it was small, it was fierce. She had gathered those who believed in her, who saw in her the hope that had been missing from the kingdom for so long. They would fight with her not because of her royal blood, but because they believed in her strength, her vision, and the ancient power that now pulsed through her veins. The time for waiting was over. The Zalkari were coming, and they would not stop until they had consumed everything in their path. But Lyra, the once useless princess, was no longer waiting. She was ready to lead her people into battle. And for the first time in her life, she knew that she could never be stopped. The first strike. The dark sky above the palace seemed to mirror the growing tension within its walls. The threat of the Zalkari was no longer a distant rumor. It was reality. As Lyra prepared for the inevitable conflict, every corner of her once proud kingdom buzzed with fear. The palace, the last stronghold of the royal family, was now nothing more than a fortress of desperation. King Zorath, who had once ruled with unmatched authority, had retreated into the shadows of his own mind, lost in thoughts of doom. He no longer carried the air of invincibility. The Zalkari had crushed that illusion with their cold, unstoppable advance. Lyra, on the other hand, was no longer the helpless princess who cowered in the shadows. She had become a warrior, fierce and determined, preparing for a war that would either save her people or destroy them. But the first strike was imminent, and her father's refusal to accept her as an ally on the front lines only fueled her desire to prove him wrong. Her training in the hidden chambers of the palace had changed her. The weight of the sword now felt natural in her hands. The ancient power she had discovered pulsed within her like a second heartbeat, a living force that heightened every sense, every instinct. But no amount of preparation could have fully prepared her for the moment that came when the first strike of the Zalkari invasion hit the kingdom. It was early in the morning when the sirens began. The sound of them wailing through the palace corridors was deafening, cutting through the silence that had hung in the air for so long. Lyra was already on her feet, her body instinctively moving toward the command center. Her thoughts raced as the terror outside finally became a reality. The Zalkari were here. The palace shook with the first blast. The ground trembled as if the world itself was being torn apart. Lyra's heart raced as she sprinted through the halls, her mind already calculating their next move. Her father had sealed himself in his chambers, refusing to leave his throne. The generals were scrambling to organize defenses, but Lyra knew it would be too little, too late. As she entered the command center, the scene before her was chaotic. Officers shouted orders, soldiers rushed to and fro, and the air was thick with the stench of fear. The grand strategy of the kingdom, meticulously planned over the centuries, was crumbling. The Zalkari ships were descending rapidly, their sleek, dark forms blotting out the sky. They were everywhere, surrounding the planet with a precision that spoke of years of preparation. "Your Highness," a voice shouted. Lyra turned to see one of her father's trusted generals, General Vorn, rushing toward her. His face was pale, his armor scratched and dented from the earlier skirmishes. "The enemy's ships are too powerful. Our defenses are failing." Lyra's gaze hardened. Her mind, sharpened by countless hours of training and study, quickly analyzed the situation. The royal fleet, despite its strength, was no match for the Zalkari. The invading forces had already breached their outer defenses, and soon the palace would be next. Her heart pounded, but she did not falter. "We need to act now," she said, her voice steady, more commanding than ever. "The palace is their next target. We can't wait for reinforcements. We must take the battle to them." General Vorn looked at her in disbelief. "But, Your Highness, you can't." "I can and I will," Lyra interrupted, her eyes burning with determination. "We don't have the luxury of waiting for orders or reinforcements. We have to fight." The general hesitated for a moment, torn between his loyalty to the king and the unexpected strength he saw in Lyra. Finally, he nodded. "I'll assemble a strike team, but you'll need to stay here, Your Highness. We can't risk you in battle." Lyra's lips twisted into a grim smile. "You don't get it, General. I'm not staying here, not anymore. I have the power to fight, and I'm not going to hide while our people die." She turned on her heel and marched toward the palace's war chamber, her footsteps ringing out with the resolve of a leader who had nothing left to lose. General Vorn followed behind, powerless to stop her. In the war chamber, the remaining generals and advisors were arguing over their next course of action. The situation had grown dire. Their forces were outnumbered, their fleet in disarray, and the Zalkari were closing in. King Zorath remained absent, refusing to take control of the situation. His eyes were locked on the distant stars outside the palace windows as if waiting for some divine intervention. Lyra entered the room without warning, her presence commanding immediate attention. The room fell silent as she strode to the center, her face set in a mask of determination. "Enough," she said firmly. "The time for waiting is over. We fight now or we lose everything. I am taking command of the next phase of our defense." The generals exchanged uncertain glances, but none dared to challenge her. They had seen her grow, had watched as she trained in secret. Her confidence was no longer that of a frightened princess. It was the presence of a warrior. Lyra quickly issued orders, organizing the remaining soldiers into small, highly skilled units. Each was to strike at the heart of the Zalkari forces, targeting weak points in their heavily armored ships. The general skepticism remained, but her unwavering authority was enough to rally their attention. As the first strike hit the heart of the capital city, Lyra was already leading her team toward the palace hangars. Their target was one of the Zalkari flagship vessels that had landed near the city. They would strike fast, cripple the ship's systems, and create a diversion that could allow the rest of their forces a fighting chance. Lyra's pulse raced as she climbed into the cockpit of a fighter ship. She had never flown in battle before, but the ancient power within her guided her movements with ease. Her instincts were sharp, her every decision clear. This was no longer about proving her worth to her father. It was about saving her people. As her team soared into the sky, the night was split with the thunder of gunfire. The Zalkari ships opened fire, their energy weapons cutting through the air like deadly blades. Lyra's heart pounded, but her grip on the controls was steady. The energy pulsing through her veins seemed to connect her to the ship, to the very air around her. Every movement she made felt effortless, as if she was one with the battlefield. The battle raged on as Lyra and her team flew headlong into the chaos. Explosions erupted around them, and the sky was filled with the shrill cries of battle. She could feel the pulse of her weapon systems as she fired on the Zalkari flagship. Each shot was precise, guided by her newfound connection to the ancient power within her. Then the Zalkari flagship began to falter. The energy shields flickered and dropped. Lyra saw her opening. "Now!" she shouted into the comms, and her team moved in for the final strike. In that moment, she was no longer the princess who had been written off as useless. She was the warrior her people needed, the leader who had brought them their first victory. The flagship exploded in a shower of debris, and the remaining Zalkari ships hesitated for a moment, their once unified assault splintering. Lyra's forces pressed their advantage, pushing back the invaders and buying the capital a much-needed reprieve. As she flew back toward the palace, the adrenaline still coursing through her veins, Lyra allowed herself a brief moment of triumph. She had led her people in their first successful strike against the Zalkari. The tide of the battle had begun to shift, but it was far from over. As the battle raged on outside, Lyra knew that this was only the beginning. The Zalkari were relentless, and they would come again. But this time they would face a different kingdom, a kingdom led by a warrior who would not rest until her people were safe. And Lyra was ready for whatever came next. The hidden power. The dust of battle still hung thick in the air. The once pristine streets of the capital were now scarred by the aftermath of destruction. The Zalkari had retreated, but their defeat was not a complete victory. They were a relentless species, and no one in the kingdom believed that they had abandoned their efforts. Instead, the silence after the battle was just the calm before the next storm. Lyra, though victorious, knew that the fight was far from over. She had glimpsed the enemy's true might, its destructive power, and she understood that what had worked in the first skirmish would not work a second time. Still, for the first time since the threat of the Zalkari had emerged, there was hope. Lyra had led the charge, striking their flagship and dealing a blow to the invaders that the generals hadn't believed was possible. Her father, once dismissive of her abilities, had witnessed her command firsthand. For the first time, King Zorath could see that his daughter was no longer the weak princess he had once written off. She was a warrior, a leader. But Lyra knew something he didn't yet understand. What had helped her defeat the Zalkari in that first battle wasn't just her training or her courage, it was something far more powerful. In the dead of night, after the adrenaline of battle had worn off and the kingdom's soldiers rested, Lyra found herself in the palace's quietest chamber, the same room where she had discovered the ancient power weeks before. The stones, now glowing faintly, beckoned her once again. The relics had chosen her and she had accepted their power. But the power still felt foreign, like something she had only just begun to understand. It was a power that surged inside her, but also seemed to whisper of an ancient, forgotten legacy, a legacy she had only begun to scratch the surface of. As she stepped into the room, the energy in the air shifted. It was as if the stones recognized her presence, their pulse growing stronger in response. She walked toward them, her fingers itching to touch the crystalline surface, to feel that pulse course through her again. But this time, something was different. This time, the energy wasn't just pulling at her, it was calling to her. Lyra reached out, her fingers trembling as they hovered over the stones. The moment she touched one, a flood of memories bombarded her senses. It was as though the past and future collided within her mind. She saw flashes of her ancestors, warriors who had fought and died to protect the galaxy. Their faces were blurred, their eyes full of resolve, and yet there was something in their expressions, something about their unrelenting will, that reminded her of herself. But then, there was a voice, deep and ancient. It echoed through her, thoughts like a distant storm, a voice that seemed to come from the stones themselves. You have awakened what was hidden within you, Lyra. But it is not enough to merely wield this power. You must understand it. You must become the vessel that holds this power, or it will consume you. Lyra staggered back, her breath catching in her throat. The voice echoed in her mind, leaving an aftertaste of danger. The energy inside her shifted, becoming more volatile, more dangerous. It was no longer just a tool, it was an entity. She was no longer merely using the power was using her. And if she didn't learn to control it, she could very well become its next victim. Her heart raced, but she steeled herself. This is what I've been training for, she reminded herself. This is why I've chosen this path. She had no choice. Now, she had to master the power or the consequences would be dire, not just for her but for her entire kingdom. As she stood there, contemplating the weight of the ancient warning, the palace doors opened behind her. General Vorn entered, his face grim. Your Highness, he said, bowing slightly. There's something you need to see. The Zalkari have returned. Lyra's pulse quickened. She had felt it. The presence, the darkness, had been growing stronger. But even she hadn't anticipated the speed at which the Zalkari would regroup. They had retreated only hours ago, yet now they were back. "Where?" Lyra demanded, turning toward the general. Her eyes blazed with a quiet fury. She had fought for one victory, but she knew it had only been a taste. The Zalkari were relentless, and it was only a matter of time before they came back in full force. "They've already breached our outer defenses," Vorn reported, his voice tight with urgency. "A larger fleet than before, and they've brought new weapons, things we've never seen. It's as if they were holding something back." Lyra's mind raced. New weapons, something they were hiding. In that moment, a plan began to form. Lyra understood what the Zalkari were doing. They weren't just seeking victory, they were testing her. They knew she had awakened something in herself, and they wanted to see how far she had come. "Gather the troops," she said, her voice steady but commanding. "We go to them now." "Your Highness, please." General Vorn hesitated. "We're not ready. We need more time." "We have no time," Lyra interrupted sharply. "The longer we wait, the more they will learn about us. We need to strike now. I will lead the charge. Prepare the fleet." The general opened his mouth to argue, but Lyra's gaze was unyielding. With a curt nod, he stepped back and issued the necessary orders. Lyra turned back to the glowing stones, feeling the energy thrumming inside her, beckoning her forward. As she left the room, the power inside her swelled. She felt it again, faster this time, stronger. She could hear the voice in her head once more. "You are not ready, Lyra. If you follow this path, there will be no turning back. It will consume you. Do you understand?" Her hand tightened around the hilt of her blade, and she spoke aloud for the first time to the voice that had become her constant companion. "I understand," she said, her voice low but fierce. "But I am ready. The Zalkari will not take this kingdom, and I will not let my people fall." With that, she left the chamber, her steps purposeful and heavy with the weight of her decision. She knew the path ahead would be fraught with peril. The Zalkari had tested her once, and they would test her again. But this time she wouldn't be the helpless princess cowering in the palace. She would be the warrior who stood at the front, leading her people into the heart of battle. As the fleet prepared for launch, Lyra boarded her fighter, the power inside her surging once more. The Zalkari would come for her, but they would find something they had never expected. She wasn't just a princess anymore, she wasn't just a leader, she was the embodiment of the kingdom's last hope, and she was ready to show the galaxy what a useless princess could do. Betrayal and redemption. The air was thick with the tension of an impending storm. Lyra could feel the weight of every decision pressing on her as the Zalkari fleet loomed larger on the horizon, their weapons capable of obliterating the last remnants of the kingdom. Every moment felt like a countdown to disaster. Her strike team had been preparing for days, and Lyra had made plans to confront the Zalkari head-on. The battle ahead would determine whether her people lived or died. But even as her forces gathered, Lyra's thoughts couldn't shake the creeping sense of uncertainty that gnawed at her. Despite her victory in the first battle, Lyra knew that the war had only just begun. The Zalkari were relentless, and they had shown no mercy in their previous attacks. The time for defense was over. It was time to strike. Yet, as the days passed, something was amiss within the palace. The generals who had sworn to follow her now hesitated, their loyalty divided. Whispers filled the halls. Some believed the kingdom's only chance of survival lay in surrender. Others questioned Lyra's ability to lead, unsure of the power she wielded and the risks she had taken. Her father, King Zorath, had become a shadow of the man he once was. His confidence had evaporated under the weight of defeat, and he had secluded himself in the royal chambers, consumed by fear. He would not acknowledge Lyra's leadership, let alone take part in the war council. And worse, there were rumors circulating that he was secretly considering surrendering to the Zalkari. Lyra couldn't afford to wait for her father's approval. She had no time to waste. The Zalkari would strike at any moment, and the kingdom needed her. With her generals and soldiers still fractured by doubt, she turned to the one ally she could trust, General Vorn. Vorn had been with her since the first battle, the one who had reluctantly followed her orders and witnessed her rise to leadership. He was the only one who had truly seen her potential and had stood by her, even when others doubted her abilities. Yet, as she walked toward his command post, she could see the conflict in his eyes. "General," Lyra said, stepping into the room, her voice calm but unwavering. "I need your loyalty more than ever now. We cannot falter. The Zalkari are already on the move, and we are the last defense. Will you fight by my side?" Vorn's gaze dropped to the ground, a mixture of hesitation and sorrow in his expression. For a long moment, he said nothing. Then, he finally lifted, his eyes to meet hers, and his words struck her like a blow. "I have no choice, Lyra. But I fear that some among us are already making plans to betray you." Lyra's heart skipped a beat. "Betrayal?" she whispered, her voice cracking under the weight of the word. "Who would betray us now after everything we've fought for?" Vorn shook his head, his expression grim. "There are whispers, Your Highness. Some of your father's closest allies, they are considering surrender. They believe that your power is too dangerous, that you are a risk to the kingdom. They believe the only way to save the Empire is to negotiate with the Zalkari." The betrayal stung deeper than any wound Lyra had ever known. It wasn't just the generals or the officers who had abandoned her. It was the very people who should have had her back, those who had sworn loyalty to her father and his kingdom. She was now seen as a threat, an outsider to the very empire she had sworn to protect. "Are you saying my father?" she began. But Vorn cut her off with a sharp gesture. "I believe King Zorath has lost faith, Princess," he said quietly. "He has hidden himself away, and it is clear he no longer believes we can win. He thinks the Zalkari are unstoppable. If he had his way, we would kneel to them, give up everything to save our lives." The words hit Lyra like a hammer, but she quickly steeled herself. This wasn't just about betrayal. It was about saving the people who depended on her, saving the kingdom from the Zalkari. She had no time for the doubts of those who couldn't see the power inside her. "We will not surrender," Lyra declared, her voice rising in strength. "We will fight. If my father won't lead, then I will. I'll lead this army myself. I'll show them what it means to challenge a princess they once thought weak." Vorn's eyes softened as he looked at her. He saw the fire that had burned inside her since the beginning, the unyielding resolve that had transformed her from a helpless princess into the leader of an army. He nodded, his face filled with respect. "I'll follow you, Lyra. I always have." But just as she was about to move forward with her plan, the worst possible thing happened. The palace gates burst open, and a small group of soldiers entered, bearing grim news. "We've been betrayed," one of the soldiers said, his voice shaking. "There was a coup. Some of the generals have sided with the Zalkari." Lyra felt the ground shift beneath her. Her heart pounded in her chest as the soldiers delivered the shocking news. Several high-ranking officers, including some she had trusted, had defected to the Zalkari's side. They had promised to open the gates of the palace in exchange for power and safety in the new order. Her hands clenched into fists. She couldn't let this happen. This was not just an attack on her. This was an attack on everything her father had fought for. On everything her people had believed in. Lyra turned to Vorn, her eyes blazing with determination. "We need to move fast. We cannot wait any longer. If they have already betrayed us, then the Zalkari will be here soon." Together they rallied, the remaining loyal soldiers. The palace was a fortress, but it could only hold so much before the traitors inside would tear it apart from within. Lyra's eyes were sharp, calculating. She knew that a full-on battle inside the palace would only play into the Zalkari's hands. She needed to cut off the traitors quickly, before they could open the gates and allow the enemy in. Her soldiers, though outnumbered, rallied to her side with a fierce determination. The betrayal of their leaders had lit a fire in them. They weren't going to let this kingdom fall without a fight. With General Vorn at her side, Lyra led her loyal soldiers through the palace's inner halls. searching for the traitors. The silence was deafening as they moved, each step bringing them closer to the heart of the conspiracy. As they neared the royal chambers, Lyra's heart raced. She knew the time was now. As they burst into the room, the traitors turned, their eyes filled with fear and guilt. They hadn't expected Lyra to act so quickly, but it was too late. She had come for them, not as a princess, but as a warrior, prepared to take back what was rightfully hers. She met each of their gazes with cold resolve. "You have betrayed not just me, but everyone who has ever believed in this kingdom," Lyra said, her voice low and menacing. "You will not win." With swift precision, Lyra and her soldiers captured the traitors, securing them before they could signal the Zalkari. The battle for the palace was won, this time. But as Lyra looked at the fallen traitors, she knew that the real fight was still ahead. The Zalkari were coming, and no amount of betrayal could stop her now. As she stood victorious, Lyra realized something profound. She was no longer just the daughter of a king. She was the protector of her people, the warrior who would not allow her kingdom to fall. Her father's doubts, the betrayals of those around her, they meant nothing. The path was clear. The war was on, and Lyra would stop at nothing to lead her people to victory. The final showdown. The stars hung like distant cold eyes in the night sky, watching over the chaos below. Lyra stood at the edge of the palace balcony, her fingers gripping the stone rail tightly. The air was thick with tension, the horizon burning, with the light of incoming Zalkari ships. After days of relentless preparation and countless small victories, the moment of truth had finally arrived. The final battle would decide the fate of the kingdom, her kingdom, and the galaxy beyond. She had never felt the weight of her role more than she did now. The traitors had been dealt with. Her forces, now unified under her banner, were preparing for what could very well be their last stand. General Vorn stood behind her, his face grim as he observed the preparation of their fleet below. "They won't hold back," Vorn muttered, his voice edged with concern. "The Zalkari have seen our strength. They'll strike with everything they've got. We cannot afford any mistakes." Lyra turned to him, her face resolute. "I won't let them destroy everything we've built, General. We've come too far to let fear defeat us now. We fight for everything, for our people, for our kingdom, for our future." Vorn hesitated, his eyes narrowing as he studied Lyra's expression. She had grown into something far more formidable than any of them had expected. But even the strongest of warriors had their limits, and this was not just any battle. It was the final one. The Zalkari would come with full force, and they would show no mercy. "I trust you, Princess," Vorn said quietly. "But even you can't fight a war on your own." Lyra's gaze turned steely and she nodded. "I don't intend to fight alone. We have the strength of our united forces. Together we'll push them back." The moment she said the words, a vibration ran through the palace. The ground trembled beneath their feet as the first wave of Zalkari ships broke through the atmosphere, filling the sky with their dark silhouettes. The sound of distant cannon fire and explosions echoed in the distance. The war had come. In the command center, Lyra stood before her generals and advisors, the weight of their expectations heavy on her shoulders. She had become the leader they never thought she could be, the one they needed to unite them in the face of annihilation. There was no turning back now. "We'll strike at their fleet first," Lyra began, her voice calm but sharp with the authority she had earned through countless trials. "We have to disable their command ships before they can launch their full assault. I'll lead the first wave myself." Her words were met with a murmur of agreement, but also hesitation. There were still those who doubted her ability to lead them in the final battle. Lyra could see it in their eyes. But now wasn't the time for doubt. She knew what she had to do, and she would not let fear paralyze her people. With the final plans in place, the fleet took off into the night sky, Lyra leading the charge. She piloted her ship with the same steady confidence she had honed over the last few weeks. The energy of the ancient relic still thrummed through her veins, guiding her every move. She could feel the Zalkari ships drawing closer, their cold energy radiating like a wall of darkness. As they closed in on the Zalkari flagship, a wave of shock and anticipation rippled through Lyra's forces. This was it, the moment that would either save them all or wipe them from the galaxy. Lyra's ship was one of the first to break through the enemy lines, her pulse sharp in her ears as the Zalkari ships loomed large in her view. She felt the cold weight of the energy weapons aimed at her, but she didn't flinch. The power inside her surged forward, amplifying her senses to a level she had never felt before. In that moment, she was more than just a warrior. She was a force, alive, unstoppable, and connected to the very universe itself. As the first volley of fire came toward her, Lyra dodged, her hands moving with a speed and precision that left even her soldiers in awe. Her mind was clear, focused on the enemy, on their weaknesses, on their systems. She fired back, the energy from her ship's weapons perfectly synchronized with her own newfound abilities. One by one, Zalkari ships began to fall, their shields flickering and collapsing under the weight of her strikes. But the battle wasn't over. As the enemy flagship began to fight back with ferocity, Lyra could feel a familiar presence, a presence that struck a chord deep within her. She turned her ship in the direction of the energy pulse, her eyes narrowing. Through the darkness of space, she saw it, the Zalkari King's personal flagship. The air in the cockpit grew tense as the flagship moved into position. This was the heart of the enemy forces. If she could destroy it, she would cripple the entire Zalkari fleet. But as she approached, something unexpected happened. A massive energy blast shot out from the flagship, striking her ship directly. The force threw Lyra into the control panel, her body crashing against the seat. For a moment, everything went black. But Lyra's connection to the power within her flared, pulling her back to consciousness. Her vision cleared and she could hear the voices of her crew calling out her name, their worry cutting through the haze. "Princess, can you hear me?" General Vorn's voice crackled over the comms. "We've lost your signal. What's your status?" Lyra's fingers gripped the controls as she wiped the blood from her forehead, a small but burning fire of determination igniting in her chest. "I'm still here," she said, her voice fierce. "And we're not done yet. Prepare for the final strike." With renewed resolve, Lyra locked her sights on the Zalkari flagship. She pushed her ship to its limits, accelerating toward the massive vessel. In that moment, as the ship grew larger in her view, Lyra realized something profound. She was no longer the princess who had been dismissed, who had been told she was weak. She was the warrior, the leader who had earned the right to command, who had fought not just for herself, but for her people. The Zalkari flagship was within range, and Lyra didn't hesitate. With a cry of fury, she unleashed the full force of her weapons, the energy coursing through her like wildfire. The blast struck the flagship's weak point, tearing through its hull in an explosion that rocked the very fabric of space itself. For a moment, everything seemed to pause. The enemy fleet faltered, their command ship crippled. The Zalkari had no clear leader to coordinate the attack. Lyra's forces took full advantage of the opening, striking the remaining ships with relentless precision. One by one, the Zalkari forces began to retreat, their ranks breaking as Lyra's warriors pushed forward. As the last of the enemy ships fell, Lyra's heart raced. The battle was over. The Zalkari had been defeated, and their invasion had been repelled. Her people were safe. But the victory was bittersweet. Lyra sat back in her seat, exhausted and battered from the fight. The silence in her cockpit was deafening, broken only by the sound of her labored breathing. The war had taken everything from her. Her father was still locked away in his chambers, and while the kingdom had won, Lyra knew that there would be no turning back from what she had become. She had crossed a line, and there was no going back to the life she had once known. As the last of the smoke from the battlefield dissipated, Lyra's ship hovered over the now quiet capital. Her soldiers cheered below, but her mind was still caught in the storm of the battle. She had led them to victory, but at what cost? The weight of leadership, of responsibility, hung heavily on her shoulders, and yet she couldn't help but feel a quiet pride. The kingdom had survived, her people had survived, and Lyra had become the ruler they needed. The war was over, but the journey was just beginning. The galaxy had changed, and so had Lyra. She had risen from the ashes of doubt and betrayal to stand as the unchallenged ruler of a new era. The Zalkari had been defeated, but the future, her future, remained unknown. One thing was certain, however: she would never back down. Not now, not ever.